Can I say how good it is to be here again to talk to you about the budget? I suppose when I'm sort of looking at the budget from the big picture, and I've tried to sort of summarise a few of the key points, it's very political. I think if you go back 12 months, all the rhetoric was about if we don't have a surplus, we won't be credible, and we need to get there. Where we're at now is basically very much different to that. The path back is all about letting, if you like, the weaker economy flow through to a deficit, and you're really not getting a lot of policy action anytime soon. The surplus, well, you get basically a balanced budget by about 2015-16, and you don't get a surplus to 16-17. I think there's some positive, from an economist's point of view, features of the budget. One is there has been some winding back of middle-class welfare. You always have to be careful because some people like that. But basically there has been some repairs, particularly, I mean, last year it was all about spreading the benefits of the mining boom. All those sort of spreading of the benefits have gone, as have baby bonuses, and you've also got some national disability and education funding that's coming through. That's going to basically be very important in the medium term, but the question about how you fund it in the short term I think is an interesting issue. I think if I had to summarise it, I say this is a budget that sort of acknowledges this is a weaker economy. The government doesn't say it's a weaker economy, but that's essentially the way they've framed it. The next thing I'd say is when you look at the budget forecasts, their forecasts are pretty similar in terms of the real economy as we are. So that probably means we're all going to be wrong again, but basically I don't have a lot of problems there. One problem I do have in terms of the budget is they continue to have much stronger nominal GDP than we do. Now, that might sound a bit technical, but basically that's the reason that they got everything wrong last time. In other words, they were saying there was a lot of growth in profits and wages and things like that. So we live in a nominal world, and the nominal numbers they've got are very, very high. For us on rates, the other thing I'd say is that we still expect another rate cut by the end of the year. Okay, so if I then move to the next slide, just some really big picture stuff, and there's a lot more detail on our website that you can basically pick up. What the slide's saying is, from a big picture point of view, the three big expenditure patterns are road and rail, 24 bill, school improvements, 9 billion, and the National Disability Scheme of about 19 billion. What the slide also says, which I think is really interesting, is if you actually look over the estimates period, i.e. the period where you've got detailed calculations, i.e. the next 4 years, the actual impact on the spending is very little. In other words, most of the big spend is just the other side of where they're counting what the surplus and deficit is going to be. So you can sort of get a feel for what that's happening. In terms of how do you fund it, the Medicare levy is basically there, and so these are the equivalent numbers for the forward estimates. That's really large. It's $11.5 billion over the forward estimates. Tightening up of offshore tax arrangements, offshore banking units, the baby bonus, as I said. Again, the scrapping of the last year's family benefit arrangements. Clean energy package, they've come clean that they're not going to get $25 a tonne in carbon tax forever. The current European price is $5 a tonne, and so if you get $5 a tonne rather than 25, you don't get as much revenue. And there's also some specials there in terms of ramping up tax avoidance, if you like. If you sort of, and I live in a banker's world, we talk about JAWS all the time. So if I go to the next slide, this is my attempt to show you what a JAWS version, by which I'm saying what is revenue and what is expenses as a percent of GDP and what's happened through time. And if you look at the blue line is actually what's happened to their revenue. And the dotted line as you go further out is what they're expecting to happen as they go forward. So this is very much a story of fixing the jaws by getting the revenue to come back, and particularly the idea of the tax increases that basically show up next year, but you don't actually spend for the disability program till a couple of years down the road. And on the expense side, basically there's not a lot of changes on expenses. Again, that's not what the government says, but that's essentially what the data's showing. In the next slide, we sort of just basically break it up a little bit. On the left-hand side, the corporate tax as a percentage of their gross operating surplus, in other words, how much money are the corporates paying, and then underneath it in blue, how much are the individuals paying. And so what you sort of had was you've had a big collapse in corporate profitability and therefore corporate tax post the GFC, and it's sort of going to go back up, and there's been a lot of tax cuts over the last 7 or 8 years that have sort of eroded the base, and again they expect to take it up. The right-hand side is showing personal benefits as a percent of GDP. Unfortunately, the budget doesn't give you any numbers for that, which would be nice, but they don't give you everything. But underneath it, the GST. And one of the things that people don't say very often is that because you've had a high dollar and you've had a lot of discounting in the sectors that are involved, the actual GST take has come down. And so that's sort of further complicated life for the government. So they've got negative jaws. They're fixing it almost entirely by using the revenue leader. And the big spends, as I said, are coming towards the end. If you then think about what is the budget doing to the economy, and if we go to the next slide, this sort of gives you a feel for it. As the bar goes up, that's like tightening. As the bar goes down, that's essentially using the budget to sort of help the economy. And if you go back a couple of years during the GFC, what you see is a very, very, very large fiscal injection to try and protect the economy. Last year, you basically see a big tightening because the economy wasn't that good, and even though they didn't get their surplus, they still improved the deficit position by about $20 billion. And then you go into the forecasting period, and what you see is nothing, basically. So what they've done is just let everything go through to the economy. By about 3 or 4 years out, you're probably taking off about 0.5% of GDP. But if you look back through time, that's not very much at all in terms of what it's doing. And if we then just move on a little bit into the next slide, left-hand side is showing a similar sort of story. How much is structural, how much is cyclical, and what's going to happen on the right-hand side to the budget cash balance. Blue is sort of the headline, and the red is basically taking account, if you like, take the economy out. So what it's sort of saying is, from a spending point of view, they're currently in deficit of about 1.5% of GDP. And then as they go forward, they get back to a structural balance by 2016-17. So it's an economy from a budget point of view that's pretty neutral. The uncertainties, the next slide. Obviously, who knows what's going to happen post the election. And some people say, well, they've got it in, and so therefore it'll be LAW law, tax cuts, as we had a few years ago with Keating. Answer is the opposition, whatever they want to do, can have a mini budget, and so you just got no idea what's going to happen. I've already mentioned the problem that you've got a lot of expenses that are kicking in right towards the end of the period, and so it's very difficult to know what exactly is going to happen in 2016-17. Will we've had a recession or not? And you just don't know what the state of the budget and the economy is going to be at that stage. Election, we've still got an election to come, and you always sort of worry a little bit that they'll spend some money somehow. And generally a couple of other comments as I'll move on to looking at the world economy in Australia. I've mentioned before, I'm a bit worried about these nominal numbers that the government's got, and I'm also slightly nervous that they've got a stronger view of the world. If we go to the next slide, and I just wanted to sort of highlight, there's a lot of charts here. The left-hand side is sort of showing you what the forecasts were, if you sort of start off on, as each iteration, if you like, going through the budget of what they thought would happen and where did you end up. So the left-hand side is showing you the balance of the deficit, and so it's saying that they got it wrong spectacularly. If you look in the middle, these are things like real GDP that people take a lot of notice of, and what you see is there's not really a big change between what they were expecting and what they actually got. Where the big difference is nominal GDP, and that's over in the far right-hand side with the sort of red line around it. And basically they were expecting something like 6 for nominal GDP, and they're going to get, they think 3, I actually think 2. So that sort of does make me feel slightly nervous about what they're happening. One thing I always get asked about debt, so I thought I'd just put up a slide. We go to the next one. You're going to hear a lot about we're indebted, etc., and we can't afford it, etc. So this is just a graph that sort of shows Australia's public sector debt as a percent of GDP, and I've put just about every other country I can find on it, and that's where we are. So as a percent of GDP, do we have room to do more? If we get into trouble, the answer is probably we're in a better place than just about any other country in the world. So debt to GDP ratios in Greece and Japan are just outrageous, but even the core ones, Germany, etc., have much worse position than us.